After being frozen for 20 years, the girl finally woke up. During those 2 decades, it seemed as though time had stood still. Her appearance remained completely unchanged. Disoriented, she stumbled out of the laboratory, managing to reach a bus station. She boarded a bus, pulled out 501, and extended her hand for the change. The driver informed her that an adult fare was now 1,310 won. Confused, she wondered how the price could have risen so much overnight. Unaware that 20 years had passed, Miran believed it was still the same day. The driver, thinking she was short on cash, let her stay on the bus without any trouble. When Miran arrived at her house, she found it empty and abandoned. Assuming her parents had been evicted due to unpaid rent, she tried to contact them using the cell phone. She carried a device from 2 decades earlier. Unfortunately, the phone no longer worked. Desperate, she visited a phone repair shop where the technician informed her the phone was irreparable and completely outdated. Left with no other choice, she went to the police station for help. At the station, Miran explained her situation, saying she had seen her family just the day before. She couldn't comprehend how they had suddenly disappeared. The police asked for identification, and with trembling hands, she handed over her ID card. The officers were shocked. Her card indicated she was born in 1976 and was now 44 years old. However, the young woman standing before them looked nothing like someone in her 40s. Using her ID information, the police tracked down her mother's phone number. Miran left a voice message. On the other end, Miran's mother heard the voice of her long-lost daughter and broke into tears. Hearing the commotion, Miran's father and younger brother rushed to her side, and the whole family hurried to the police station, overwhelmed with emotion. The police informed them that Miran had headed to her old school, so they set off once again to find her. At the school, Miran sat at a desk, stunned. Around her, students used smartphones and Bluetooth headsets, chatting in unfamiliar terms about things she didn't understand. The environment felt alien. Then, her gaze shifted to a school banner that read, Hook School's 3rd semester, 2019. She also noticed the number 2019 printed on everyone's shirts. In that moment, reality hit her. She had been frozen for 20 years. Before she could fully process the shock, a familiar voice called out to her. She looked up to see her younger brother, now fully grown. Despite the decades, she recognized him instantly. Overcome with emotion, they ran to each other, embracing tightly. Her brother carried her home, where Miran discovered that her family had never given up hope. Since her disappearance, her parents had moved and lovingly kept her room exactly as it was. Seeing the untouched furniture, Miran couldn't hold back her tears. Time had passed, but her family's love for her had never faded. The truth behind Miran's disappearance finally came to light. 20 years earlier, she had participated in a 24-hour hibernation experiment for 500,000 won. At the time, Miran was a university student from a poor family. She worked multiple part-time jobs to support them, especially to fund surgery for her younger brother, who was unwell. One day, Dongchen, a director from a TV variety program, approached her with an offer. He promised her 500,000 won if she participated in the experiment, and desperate for money, Miran agreed. The experiment, however, took a disastrous turn. During the program, the professor overseeing the process suffered a sudden accident. In his disoriented state, the professor staggered to the freezer, retrieved several vials of medicine, mixed them together, and injected them into both participants. The freezer, which had been running the experiment, began heating up rapidly, melting the ice inside. As the system malfunctioned, the freezer doors opened automatically, and the professor collapsed on the ground. The hearts of the two people started beating again, and the blood vessels across their bodies seemed to come back to life. Miran's hands twitched, and soon she began to breathe again. Despite having been frozen for 20 years, her appearance was completely unchanged. She still looked like she was 24 years old. When Miran returned home, the realization that she had lost 20 years of her life hit her hard. She couldn't accept it. Enraged, she grabbed the letter of guarantee and stormed to the TV station. The employees who recognized her were shocked, but Miran ignored them, heading straight for Dongchen. Without hesitation, she slapped him hard across the face and burst into tears, shouting, "Give me back those 20 years. You're responsible for my lost life." People nearby stared in curiosity, but Dongchen quickly took her aside to talk. Miran demanded an explanation. Dongchen, clearly emotional, told her that he was equally frustrated because he had just woken up himself. The two of them talked and cried together, Once they calmed down, Miran pulled out the guarantee paper, a document written by the president of the television station 20 years ago. After reviewing it, Miran told them she wanted compensation. She did a quick calculation. 24 hours of hibernation was worth 500,000 won, meaning every hour was valued at 21,000 won. A year would amount to 8.71 million won, and over 20 years, the total came to 70 billion won. Everyone was stunned. Even if the TV station were sold, it wouldn't cover that amount. The chairman nervously suggested they compensate her gradually, assuring her the issue would be resolved. Deciding to move forward, Miran chose to return to university and finish the degree she had left incomplete. She approached her professor and explained her intention to retake the course. When asked to state her major, Miran confidently replied, "Chinese literature, class of '96." The professor was so shocked that he froze on the spot. On her first day back, Miran attended class dressed in 20th century fashion, drawing everyone's attention, especially a curious boy who even offered her a drink. Things became stranger when the professor entered the classroom. He immediately recognized Miran and was so startled that his legs gave way. It turned out he was Miran's ex-boyfriend, the same man who had betrayed her 20 years ago. Meanwhile, Dongchen also struggled to adapt to his new reality. After waking up, he stumbled through the streets, feeling dizzy and disoriented. Eventually, he collapsed and was taken to the hospital. The doctors examined him and were puzzled. His pulse and breathing were normal, but his body temperature was an abnormal 31.5 degrees Celsius, far lower than the human average of 36.5 degrees Celsius. Dongchen woke up briefly and insisted he needed to leave because of filming obligations, but his weakened body wouldn't allow it. Doctors tried multiple thermometers, but his body temperature remained at 31.5 degrees Celsius. Surprised, the doctor asked Dongchen if there was someone they could contact. With difficulty, Dongchen provided the phone number and name of his deputy director before fainting again. On the other side of town, Deputy Director Hyunki received a call from the hospital. Hearing Dongchen's name, Hyunki's hands trembled. He immediately informed the station president, and the two rushed to the hospital. Dongchen's family also heard the news and hurried over. When they arrived, they were shocked to see Dongchen, who still appeared young, as if time had stopped for him. Dongchen, confused, looked at his elderly mother and asked, "Why have you aged so much in just one night?" His confusion only deepened when he saw his younger aunt calling him brother, and an older man referring to himself as Hyunki, now clearly aged. Overwhelmed, Dongchen ran out of the hospital room and into the lobby, where he saw the year displayed, 2019. At last, Dongchen accepted the shocking truth: he had been frozen for 20 years. Remembering Miran, who had been part of the same experiment, Dongchen immediately told Hyunki to locate her. However, when they arrived at Miran's former home, they found it empty. Dongchen returned home with his family after being missing for 20 years. The house had changed significantly during that time. His younger brother and sister had used up all their money, and the family was now running a small grill shop to make ends meet. Dongchen's younger brother was married and had a beautiful daughter, while their father had sadly passed away a few years ago. Although the family was curious about Dongchen's disappearance, they chose not to ask him any questions. Dongchen was relieved to be home safely and felt content. Determined to find out why he woke up after 20 years, Dongchen visited the old lab where he met Professor Joe Kibyum. Kibyum took him to see the main professor, who had lost his memory. Kibyum explained that the professor had used every ounce of his strength to wake them up, but had hidden their information because, back then, someone intentionally caused the professor's car to explode. If those responsible found out he was alive, they would stop at nothing to kill him. The full truth could only be uncovered once the professor regained his memory. It was Dongchen's first day back at work at the TV station. As soon as he sat down, a younger colleague approached him to show him how things worked, which made Dongchen feel slightly awkward. To make matters worse, the colleague grabbed Dongchen's chin and critiqued his appearance. Hyunki walked in, showing deep respect for Dongchen, which startled those around them. Dongchen scolded Hyunki for allowing such unprofessional behavior, and Hyunki quickly apologized. The others were left wondering who Dongchen was to command such authority. 20 years earlier, Dongchen had been a famous producer with multiple awards to his name. At that time, Hyunki was just an apprentice working under him. Now that Dongchen had returned, he proposed ideas for game shows, such as mixing survival challenges with documentaries featuring celebrities. However, His colleagues dismissed these ideas as outdated, believing Dongchen was out of touch with the modern world. To catch up with current trends, Dongchen asked Youngki to accompany him to watch popular game shows and teach him how to use a computer. The following day, Dongchen went to the police station to investigate his disappearance. To his dismay, he discovered that none of the people he knew, including his girlfriend, had revealed they participated in the hibernation experiment. Feeling deeply disappointed, Dongchen realized he had hidden the truth about the experiment to protect the TV station, and that was why he had disappeared for so long. Furious, he confronted Youngki, grabbing him by the collar and demanding to know why he hadn't reported the hibernation experiment to the police. Dongchen accused him of being selfish. He then went to see Ha-young, his girlfriend from 20 years ago, and questioned why she hadn't tried to look for him or acknowledge his disappearance. Ha-young tearfully confessed that she had been burdened with guilt all these years. She had remained unmarried and had been waiting for Dongchen's return, but Dongchen couldn't forgive her. She was the person he had loved most, and her inaction hurt him deeply. Ha-young broke down crying, asking what she could do to earn his forgiveness, but Dongchen said nothing and walked away. Memories of their happier times together haunted him, leaving him unsure how to face her. Meanwhile, Miran, who had also been hibernating with Dongchen, reconnected with her old friends. When they reunited, the three of them hugged each other joyfully, jumping up and down with excitement. Seeing Miran's youthful appearance, her friends suspiciously joked that she must have taken some kind of magical elixir. Eager to start her life again, Miran, who was close to graduating, applied for jobs. However, interviewers rejected her after seeing that she was 44 years old with no work experience. Frustrated, Miran argued that she was really only 24, as the last 20 years had been spent frozen. Left with no choice, she sought out Dongchen and declared her desire to work in radio and television, specifically wanting to join his game show team. Dongchen, skeptical, explained that she wasn't suited for the job, but Miran insisted she could excel at it. Impressed by her determination, Dongchen agreed. At the same time, he delivered some troubling news he had learned from the professor. The body temperature of people who had been frozen was abnormally low at 31.5 degrees Celsius, with 33 degrees Celsius being the upper limit. If their temperature exceeded that, their lives could be at serious risk. Even though Miran was 44 years old, she still looked young and beautiful. Her radiant smile caught Dongchen's attention. He walked over and handed her a new cell phone, as a token of gratitude for her decision to introduce her best friend to him. Dongchen glanced at the two charming women in front of him, and sensing their enthusiasm, he quickly found an excuse to leave. Miran, now holding the phone Dongchen had given her, immediately sent him a cute emoticon. Seeing the message made Dongchen smile. When he arrived at the company, Dongchen went to find Miran. She excitedly told him how amazing the phone's features were. By accident, their eyes met, and for a moment, it felt as if they could hear the sound of each other's hearts beating faster and faster. That evening, after work, the two of them walked to the parking garage together. Suddenly, a man appeared and pressed a knife against Dongchen's back. Dongchen raised his hands in surrender, and before they knew it, the two were locked inside the trunk of a car. The kidnappers assumed that the freezing temperature inside the trunk would make them pass out. However, they had no idea that Dongchen and Miran, who had both been hibernating for 20 years, were calmly chatting as if nothing had happened. The car eventually stopped on a deserted road. One of the kidnappers opened the trunk to check if they were still alive. To his shock, Dongchen and Miran were perfectly fine. The kidnappers immediately demanded to know the whereabouts of Professor Huang, the scientist responsible for the hibernation experiment. Dongchen firmly said they didn't know. The kidnapper, trembling from the cold, kept pressing them for answers. At that moment, the two fought back. Dongchen grabbed the kidnapper's hair and yanked hard, while Miran seized the opportunity to deliver a sharp kick to a sensitive spot. The kidnapper collapsed to the ground in pain. Amid the struggle, the kidnapper's phone fell to the ground. Miran quickly grabbed it while Dongchen stepped forward to help. However, the kidnapper wasn't giving up easily, and the fight continued for a while. Dongchen and Miran finally managed to work together, kicked open the car door, and escaped. Before leaving, Dongchen threatened the remaining kidnapper by saying he had already called the police. Panicked, the kidnapper hastily drove away. As they walked along the dark, empty road, Dongchen couldn't help but wonder why they hadn't forced the kidnapper to take them back. Now, they were left with no choice but to walk home. After some time, Miran's body temperature began to rise dangerously. Noticing her condition, Dongchen quickly picked her up and ran. Just when they thought they were about to lose consciousness, they saw a car approaching. Summoning his last ounce of strength, Dongchen stopped the car and rushed Miran to the hospital. At the hospital, Miran's fever subsided after taking medication, and Dongchen immediately cooled himself down by pouring cold water on his body. Once Miran was out of danger, Dongchen finally felt a sense of relief. The next day, Dongchen visited Professor Kibium to find a solution to their worsening condition. Professor Kibium explained that the only way to restore their body temperatures to normal was known by Professor Huang, who unfortunately had amnesia. Without knowing when Professor Huang might regain his memory, they could only come up with temporary measures to manage their condition. Determined to prevent such incidents from happening again, Dongchen bought temperature monitoring devices to track their body heat at all times. He also stocked up on fever-reducing medicine and gave Miran some to carry with her in case of emergencies. That day, as Miran was leaving the classroom, a professor suddenly blocked her path. The moment he opened his mouth and said her name, Miran recognized him. He was her ex-boyfriend who had betrayed her 20 years ago. Now, out of nowhere, he wanted to come back into her life. If it were you, would you agree? Boldly, he asked Miran to return to him, reminding her that she participated in the hibernation experiment because of him. Annoyed, Miran firmly replied, "Let's not see each other again." Byung-shim, completely unbothered, pinched Miran's cheek and said she looked adorable when she was angry. He even dared to say he wanted to rekindle their passionate love from years ago. Miran thought he had lost his mind and reminded him he was already married. Without hesitation, Byung-shim declared that for Miran's sake, he would immediately get a divorce. He then hugged her tightly, which was the last straw for Miran. Furious, she grabbed her bag and hit him. The scene escalated, and both of them ended up being escorted to the police station. As they arrived, Byung-shim pleaded with the police not to punish Miran. When asked about their relationship, Byung-shim shamelessly claimed, "We're going to be in a relationship in the future." Miran shot back, "No matter what happens, I'll still beat him again." The police quickly intervened to stop the situation. Just then, Dongchen rushed into the police station. He scolded Miran, telling her she shouldn't attack a professor, no matter how angry she was. But as soon as he found out the professor was Miran's ex-boyfriend, Dongchen's attitude changed completely. "You were right to hit him," he said. "How great would it be if you beat him to the point of disability?" The more Dongchen talked, the angrier he got. He stormed over to Byung-shim and warned him to stay away from Miran or face the consequences. Byung-shim refused to back down, still acting arrogant, and the two men got into a physical fight. The situation escalated again, and people had to step in to separate them. Ignoring Byung-shim, Dongchen grabbed Miran's hand and led her out of the police station. Byung-shim was left behind with a bruised face. The next day, Dongchen and Miran went to scout for a new filming location. They stopped frequently to take photos, and Miran suggested they explore inside a building to find better spots. The weather was getting hotter, and Dongchen quickly pulled her back, saying they should head outside. However, after a while, they realized they couldn't find their car. Their body temperatures began rising dangerously as they wandered around, lost. Dongchen could tell the situation was serious. Their body temperatures were about to hit 33 degrees Celsius, and an alarm on his watch started blaring. He sat Miran down quickly and searched her bag for fever-reducing medicine, but it wasn't there. Miran's breathing became shallow, and she fainted. Desperate, Dongchen, whose temperature was also rising, injected the only dose of medicine into Miran. Her temperature stabilized, but Dongchen's condition worsened, and he fainted as well. Some time later, Miran woke up to find Dongchen unconscious. Panicking, she called his name, but he didn't respond. At that moment, rain began to fall, as if the heavens took pity on Dongchen. The raindrops cooled his body, and after a while, he began to stir. Seeing him regain consciousness, Miran couldn't help but kiss him. Dongchen, still weak, gently brushed her hair aside. The story then flashes back 20 years. Professor Huang, who had been in charge of the hibernation experiment, lost his memory after a car accident caused by sabotage. Though he survived, the trauma left him unable to remember anything. To help him recover, Professor Kibium guided him through rehabilitation exercises, including placing his hands in ice while blindfolded and taking him to the lab. But nothing worked. Meanwhile, Lee Seok-do, the most powerful businessman in Korea, discovered that Professor Huang was still alive. He secretly ordered an investigation. Shockingly, Chairman Seok-do was identical to a mysterious man found in a freezer. To protect Professor Hwang, Dongchun and Professor Kibyum decided to take him into hiding. While traveling, they coincidentally ran into Miran's family, who were discussing how to stabilize Miran and Dongchun's body temperatures. Dongchun explained Professor Hwang's situation to them, and after a long discussion, both families decided to work together. During the day, Professor Hwang stayed at Dongchun's barbecue restaurant, and at night, he slept at Miran's home. One day, Dongchun's mother assigned the professor to peel onions, but he started crying while peeling and got scolded for it. One day, President Seok-do visited Dongchun's restaurant, pretending to be a customer. When Professor Hwang accidentally saw him, a few fragmented memories flashed through his mind, but President Seok-do didn't recognize him. The professor quickly left the restaurant. A short while later, Chairman Seok-do met with his twin brother's wife, who planned to expose his identity to the media. The truth was, Chairman Seok-do was the younger brother, who took over the position of the older brother, also named Seok-do, after he was put into hibernation due to an accident years ago. To ensure the elder Seok-do never woke up, the younger brother tried to kill Professor Hwang 3 times. Relying on flashes of his memory, Professor Hwang returned to the laboratory. He found a cabinet with a notebook containing details about restoring body temperature for hibernators. When he discovered Seok-do in the freezer, all of his lost memories suddenly came back. At that moment, he realized he was in danger. Just as he suspected, Seok-do soon found out that the professor had regained his memory. That night, as Professor Hwang was preparing to leave for home, he was kidnapped and taken to a dark, isolated room. With his eyes covered, he was threatened by Seok-do, who demanded that he disable the power source for the hibernation chamber and turn the hibernation experiment into a failure, or else he'd be killed. Meanwhile, Dongchun and Miran were unaware of the kidnapping. Left with no choice, Professor Hwang reluctantly complied. He returned to the lab and told Professor Kibyum to stop coming there because he would be taking over the laboratory himself. Sensing that something wasn't right, Professor Kibyum called Dongchun immediately. By this time, Professor Hwang was already disconnecting the power source of the hibernation chambers. Dongchun arrived just in time and demanded to know why. Professor Hwang explained that if the hibernation chambers weren't destroyed and turned into failures, all of their lives would be in danger. Dongchun pleaded, "Please save us, let us live as normal people again." Since Miran kissed Dongchun that day, their relationship progressed quickly, and they began dating. However, their situation was complicated. For people who had been in hibernation, their body temperature couldn't exceed 33 degrees Celsius, or it would be life-threatening. Because of this, they could only kiss in cold water to keep their body temperature stable. Hibernated genes were like time bombs. Life could become dangerous at any moment. One day, while Dongchun was on the phone with Miran, he suddenly felt dizzy, struggled to breathe, and collapsed. Miran sensed something was wrong and rushed out immediately. Professor Kibyum later explained to Dongchun that the hibernating gene in his body had mutated and detoxified, but after 48 hours, it would flare up again. When Miran arrived, she was worried and asked Dongchun if he was okay. Dongchun then noticed a bruise-like mark on Miran's hand, but she had no idea it was there. Professor Kibyum explained that it wasn't a normal bruise. Miran's genes might have started to mutate as well. Desperate for a solution, Dongchun asked if there was any cure. Professor Kibyum said that only Professor Hwang would know how to fix this, but he was still missing. They searched the laboratory for clues and found it completely ransacked. Professor Kibyum concluded that Seok-do had taken Professor Hwang. Fortunately, Dongchun and Miran had anticipated trouble and had already contacted Seok-do's son in advance. Thanks to their efforts, Professor Hwang was rescued safely. Meanwhile, Professor Kibyum worked tirelessly, researching an antidote from the notes in Professor Hwang's notebook. After a long night, he finally developed a potential cure. However, it was still experimental, and the side effects were unknown. One of them had to try the injection first. Without hesitation, Miran volunteered and told Professor Kibyum to test it on her. The next day, Miran received the injection before Dongchun arrived. The professor informed Dongchun that Miran had already been injected 2 hours earlier, and the antidote was successful. Dongchun, with a heavy heart, told Miran that he should have been the one to try it first. Both of them were determined to bear the risks themselves to protect the other. Without hesitation, Dongchun also took the injection. They lay side by side as Professor Kibyum explained that while the antidote worked, it only stabilized their condition. The medicine to restore their normal body temperature had yet to be developed, so they still had to be cautious about overheating. Meanwhile, Seok-do, the fake president of Chun, was holding a high-level conference. At that moment, the real president, Seok-do, suddenly appeared. A dramatic confrontation began as both men claimed to be the real Seok-do, leaving everyone confused and unsure who to believe. Seok-do's son then stepped forward and identified the man he pushed as his real father. Just then, another man stood up and said that when the former chairman handed over his position to Seok-do, he had shared a special piece of information, a phrase only the real Seok-do would know. The fake Seok-do froze in fear, unable to answer. The real Seok-do spoke the exact words the former chairman had told him, leaving no room for doubt. The truth was revealed, and the police arrived to arrest the imposter. At the same time, Professor Huang was successfully rescued. Later, Dongchen and Miran, feeling overheated, stayed in a cold room to cool down. Even with the air conditioning, they still felt hot. Suddenly, two ants crawled into the room, and the air conditioning malfunctioned, shutting off completely. Unable to leave, the two stayed in the stifling room for 2 hours before finally emerging. Around this time, Dongken's mother learned that her son was dating Miran. Worried about their hibernator status, she feared it might affect any children they might have in the future. She confronted them and asked if they were only pretending to love each other because of marriage. Dongchen was surprised and asked why she suddenly brought up marriage. Miran, overhearing the question, quickly replied, "I'm only 24 years old. I'm not even thinking about marriage." Her answer left everyone stunned. Dongken's mother dismissed the relationship, saying Miran wasn't suitable for her son. Unexpectedly, Miran responded with a playful attitude, "I'm hardworking, not picky with food, and I have a good personality. Plus, he is 70 billion won waiting at the TV station that hasn't been claimed yet. If you want an explanation, even your son's salary comes from there." Her unconventional words left Dongken's family speechless. Miran was only joking, trying to ease the situation and win over Dongken's mother. Her effort paid off. Dongken's mother smiled warmly and called Miran a very likable girl. With that, she accepted their relationship, and the future mother-in-law was won over. Meanwhile, Professor Huang continued working tirelessly to develop a medicine to restore normal body temperature. His hard work paid off, and he finally succeeded. Excited, he called Dongchen to share the good news. This time, Dongchen chose not to tell Miran, as he wanted to test the cure himself first. Professor Huang explained that after taking the medicine, Dongken's body temperature would gradually return to normal within a week. However, there would be side effects like pressure and difficulty breathing, necessary symptoms during the recovery process. After receiving the injection, Dongken's body temperature slowly increased. He endured the discomfort, knowing it was part of the cure. A short while later, Professor Huang informed Miran that Dongchen had taken the medicine first. Heartbroken and worried, Miran rushed to Dongken's side. Dongchen reassured her, promising that they would soon live like normal people. 3 days later, Dongken's pain subsided, and the worst was over. Feeling hopeful, Dongchen and Miran visited the freezer room again. This time, things were different. Dongchen could feel the cold for the first time in a long while. Miran, noticing this, asked him if he was cold. To keep her from worrying, Dongchen smiled and lied, saying he was just joking. One morning, a few days later, Dongchen woke up and realized his body temperature had returned to normal. Overjoyed, he immediately called Miran to share the good news they could finally live like normal people. However, the plan took an unexpected turn. The day before Miran was scheduled to receive her injection, a masked person with a knife showed up at an event. The knife struck Miran in the waist, and Dongchen rushed her to the hospital. Professor Huang arrived in a panic, but the doctor informed everyone that Miran's condition was critical and she needed immediate surgery. Professor Huang explained that surgery was impossible because Miran, being a hibernator, had a body temperature of only 31.5 degrees Celsius. Surgery could only be performed if her body temperature returned to normal, but that process would take a week, time Miran simply didn't have. The professor revealed the only solution, putting Miran back into hibernation until a drug could be developed to restore her body temperature. With no other options, Miran's parents and Dongchen agreed. Miran was placed back into hibernation. While she slept, Dongchen remained determined. He worked tirelessly every day, holding on to the belief that Miran would wake up someday. He often visited her in the freezer room, keeping her company. Meanwhile, the professors continued their relentless work to develop a drug that could quickly restore body temperature for those in hibernation. To better care for Miran's family, Dongchen moved into their house. Over time, Miran's family grew to see Dongchen as one of their own. Together, they waited patiently, filled with hope that Miran would awaken. Suddenly, 3 years passed. Dongchen had become a famous producer, though his temper had grown noticeably short. Then, the scene shifted. Professor Huang had finally developed a new drug. Excited, he immediately called Dongchen to share the news. Dongchen, along with Miran's parents, rushed to the laboratory. Professor Huang explained that 30 minutes after the injection, Miran's body temperature would be restored, and surgery would need to happen immediately. However, it was still uncertain whether Miran would survive the operation. Time crawled by, but eventually, the doctor emerged and announced that the surgery was successful. However, Miran remained in a coma, and no one knew when or if she would wake up. Dongchen spent his days worried and on edge, constantly visiting her. Finally, one day, while Dongchen was out of town, he received a call. Professor Huang told him that Miran had woken up. Dongchen rushed to the hospital, where he found Miran sitting in a chair, waiting for him. After 3 long years, the two lovers were finally reunited. The moment was beyond words. Not long after, Dongchen's family gathered together. Dongchen's mother, once again, brought up marriage. She asked Miran if she had any plans. Miran replied, as she had before, that she was only 24 years old and had no intention of getting married. She also expressed her desire to study abroad. This made Dongchen nervous. If Miran felt this way, what did she think of him? After all, even though he was technically only 35 years old, his real age was 55. Standing next to Miran, he felt much older, and his worries were valid. To make things worse, Miran added that she wanted to pursue both master's and doctoral degrees, which would take 5 years. By then, Dongchen would be 60 years old. Although Dongchen was furious, claiming that Miran was the person he intended to marry, he had no choice but to accept her plans. In the end, he reluctantly decided to follow Miran around the world, supporting her dreams. And so, the movie came to an end. Thank you for joining me on this journey. See you again in the next videos on the Cine Recaps.